is matcha? And should you really be getting all crazy about it? Let's find out. Hi, tea friends. This is Elsa with Nanoshan, where we share in the pleasure of drinking and discovering genuine farm tea together. If you're new to our channel, welcome. We hope that you'll learn some more about tea, maybe expand your brewing skills, and if you like what you're seeing, please don't forget to subscribe and give us 2 thumbs up. So, chances are that, like all of us, you've been unable to avoid this matcha craze that's been sweeping the world, whether you've had a matcha latte or have eaten some matcha cookies, or actually have even taken it a step further and are whisking away your own matcha every morning. We thought it could be a good opportunity to really look more closely at what pure matcha is and should be, and how to recognize good matcha. And why it's worth it. So, interestingly enough, ground tea actually came to Japan by way of China. And it was really when Japan underwent its period of isolation starting in the 1600s that China kept on developing loose-leaf tea production methods, and Japan really focused on perfecting this powdered green tea, which by today is really considered the epitome of premium Japanese tea. So there are a couple of things which are important to denotate matcha from other kinds of powdered teas out there. So a ceremonial grade matcha is a green tea powder made from tea that was shaded before harvest, and that has then been ground by a stone mill. So these are a couple of really important points to keep in mind, because there is a lot of just green tea powder being sold out there, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but really for it to be a higher end premium or even ceremonial grade matcha, the tea plant has been shaded before harvest. So actually you will find trees that for really high-end matchas have been shaded for up until about even 40 days. And then on the lower end, maybe it's about 12 days. Really on average, it's about 21 days of shading of the tea plant before harvest. And during this shading, actually the amount of shading is gradually increased until the tea plant is only receiving about 10% of sunlight coming at it from the sun. So a couple of things that are important in tea production. First of all, which cultivar is being used. The cultivars which are preferred for matcha are the ones which are darkness resistant, since it undergoes this intense and somewhat difficult for the tea plant shading period, as well as plants which will have this dark leafy green color. So the cultivars which are often used, ubiquitous of course, because it's the most widely used cultivar in Japan, but then you also see some preferred cultivars such as Uji Hikari, Sei Midori. And so what happens is a tea plant is shaded, and then when it's harvesting time, the leaves, and we'll talk a little bit later, there's 2 different ways in which the leaves can be harvested, but once they're harvested, they are then whisked away to the factory. So the first step that they undergo is typical of all Japanese green teas. It's just a steaming, but then that's where things start to get a little bit different from other Japanese green teas. So the next step is actually the wet leaves are then transported over to these gigantic aerating columns, where there's actually about 4 or 5 of these in a row, and the leaves are being blown up by this hot, dry air and going up about 4 or 5 meters up into the air, and then just being transported from one column to the next to the next. And by the time they reach the final column and this aerating process is over, the leaves, if any of them became clumped during the steaming, are separated. They are also finally much drier, and they've lost the humidity that the leaf had accumulated during the steaming. The leaves are then transported over to these brick ovens, and in these brick ovens they undergo these 3 different levels of drying. Now it's important to note here that we're actually skipping one of the steps, which is critical of other Japanese green teas. There's no rolling that happens with matcha. Why, maybe you ask? Well, it's because the rolling has to do with acquiring this thin needle-like shape, which is actually not necessary with matcha, since the end product is a powder. So we skip any sort of drying, any sort of rolling, and we skip right next to this drying period. So it's 3 different racks, in a way, in this brick oven that slowly, over a period of about 20-25 minutes, get the leaf entirely dried. So by this point, the leaf, between the aerating, between the drying, has actually broken up into these smaller, flaky, leaf-like particles that are basically dark pine, almost green in color. And then at this point, they go to the next step, which is assorting, deveining, and destemming, which is done automatically by machines. And then at this point, what we have, so this whole process is actually to create something which is not yet called matcha, but actually tencha. So tencha is the pre-matcha matcha. So up until now, you wouldn't refer to it as matcha, but as tencha. Now, unless you're somehow working in tea sourcing, you will most likely not really encounter tencha. It's not sold in stores. But if ever you do, it could be interesting to steep it. You would want to use gyokuro-like temperatures, and it could be interesting to kind of get a taste of what matcha tastes like before it's matcha. But so, at this point, actually, then what happens is the tencha leaves then go into storage. So before the storage happens, what often happens is this is the step at which wholesalers or buyers will then come into the process. There's, for example, auctions in Kyoto where farmers from all over bring their tencha, and then you have these wholesalers who come and who taste test and appearance test the different tenchas. So often, very commonly, matcha is actually a blend of 3 different tenchas, so which have been selected for various combinations of fragrance, flavor, and color. And it's also pretty cool to think that actually these wholesalers are buying their tencha and really buying what they will make matcha with, not out of this final product, but out of this sort of like middle stage product. So the tencha then goes into storage in these refrigerated facilities. They have to be air packed before that. And then during that period, the tencha sort of mellows out. And because it's still tencha, because it's in these completely airtight, cooled facilities, you actually are able to maintain the quality of the tencha much more than if the storage was happening once the leaves had already been ground into matcha powder. So this is kind of an interesting thing, which is different from other teas out there, which is that actually the exact year of harvest, of course you want a recent year, but it's not like, for example, with the Japanese shinsha, where you kind of want to be obsessing about, is this year's tea? With matcha, the concern should much more be, when was the tea ground? So because what happens is these wholesalers store the tencha, and then a customer, a buyer, will come along, will order some matcha, And that is when the grinding process occurs. At this point, so what happens is these tencha flakes, these leaves, are put into a stone mill, which is basically like these two granite slabs on top of each other. There's a hole in the top. The tencha goes in through there, and then using this wooden rod, the stone is slowly turned, and then at the bottom the tencha comes through and is very gently pulverized by these granite slabs, and out comes matcha. Out comes this absolutely brilliant, gorgeous, glowing green, bright green powder. And there is your matcha. Now, at this point, the matcha is much more vulnerable to the elements. It will oxidize very quickly, and it will degrade very quickly. So that is when really the criticality of storage comes into play. And so this actually leads us to, okay, what is high quality matcha, and how can you actually tell the difference? So you can tell quality of matcha by looking at the powder itself. Basically, a ceremonial grade matcha should be this brilliant, vivid, just absolutely gorgeous, almost neon green, tiny powder. Actually, the powder, once it's been through this slab, this granite grinding, it's really high quality matcha is 5 to 10 microns in size. So these particles are tiny, especially if you think of the fact that 1 millimeter has 1,000 microns in it. So we're looking at matcha particles between 5 to 10 microns. So that's tiny. And it should be this vivid, glowing green color. If you're encountering matcha which is more dull, a dullish green, maybe even slightly yellow, chances are that you won't really enjoy drinking it in just a bowl with your whisk and with water. That's probably a lower quality matcha, or a matcha which was not stored properly, so began to oxidize and will have lost freshness, will have lost flavors, will have certainly lost aromas. So color is always a really helpful indicator as far as matcha quality goes. So what actually plays into the quality of matcha? Of course, season. We are mostly looking for, or entirely, if we want to be drinking them just in this pure way, we're really looking for matchas that were made out of the first spring harvest. These are the buds that will have been incubating all winter, that will have been collecting as many nutrients, vitamins, minerals, flavors, aromas as the plant can possibly gather, and that it's just then bursting through into these leaves. Two other factors that play into quality of matcha. And the thing is, once we get into ceremonial grade matcha, it can get extremely expensive. And why is that? Okay, so there's two factors. The first has to do with the shading. Nowadays you encounter kind of two different kinds of shading. You can still get high quality matcha with both of them, but one of them is significantly more expensive and more time consuming, and so is becoming much more of a rarity, although it was the more traditional way. And that was actually to cover the tea plants with these bamboo mats in the shading process. So when you encounter, for example, if you're in Shizuoka or in Uji and you're looking at competition grade matchas, then these are covered in bamboo layerings, which are higher up above the tea plant. And so actually what happens when the tea plant is shaded, it wants that sunlight, right? And so it's actually reaching for it. And what's happening is that the conversion of amino acids into catechins, which have that bitterness but also are very good for you, is actually interrupted. And so we have much more L-theanine existing in shaded teas. So L-theanine is what's responsible for that fabulous umami flavor of the shaded Japanese teas. So those are the gyokuros, the kabusichas, and the matchas. And so these teas are higher in L-theanine. L-theanine is this beautiful little amino acid that will help us stay, that basically reduces stress while increasing concentration. It provides this incredible sort of like Zen-like focus. And this is actually what makes matcha, when big coffee drinkers show up and say, well, okay, I'm trying to like still get a lot of caffeine, but I need to step away from coffee. What should I drink? And matcha is often the best recommendation because it's actually the highest in caffeine of all the teas out there. And that caffeine plays with the L-theanine to actually create, you don't get that shooting up and then crash that you get of coffee, but you get this slow release of caffeine that's actually much gentler on the body, with this incredible alertness. And it's also really good at balancing moods and just really putting you in a great mindset. And it's part of what actually initially made matcha popular in Japan. So monks would actually drink matcha before meditation and found that it helped with their focus during that time. So, but I digressed. We were talking about shading. So the tea plant under this shading is developing more and more L-theanine, more and more umami. And when you have the traditional bamboo shading, the tea plant is actually growing a little bit more widely. It's freer to do so. And so that also means that then the harvest will have to be done by hand. But as we discussed in an earlier video, hand harvesting in Japan is incredibly rare. And so the more now common, frequent way of shading tea plants that are destined to make matcha is actually with these more like plastic tarps that are placed directly on the tea plants. And so the plant is still having to do that similar sort of straining for the sun, this change combination in terms of what flavors the tea plant is developing is still occurring. But then once those tarps are removed, it's because the plants have been more confined, they haven't grown as wildly, and so then they can be harvested by machines as you would with a tencha or a gyokuro or any other of the more common Japanese teas. And so you still can have really delicious matchas that were made with this process. But so then what's something else that differentiates between the different grades of matcha that we have? So far we've been talking a lot about ceremonial grade matcha, but then you also have premium, which is, it's still good. You still could drink it, in your bowl and with your whisk, but it might have a little bit more bitterness to it. So what makes a premium grade matcha versus the third grade, which is culinary grade? And so that's what goes great in cakes. That's what you want to be using in lattes. It wants sweetener, it wants some milk. You definitely wouldn't really enjoy drinking that on its own. Like, certainly you've drank some, if you've been trying different matchas out there, you've encountered some that are just like blah. Like you really can't drink them without kind of quivering. It's not enjoyable. But then when you're looking at ceremonial grade matchas, it can be incredibly sweet and savory. One of these guys that Nanua-shan is offering has these incredible chocolate notes, right? Like it can have this very sweet flavor profile, but that's really if you're looking at the more higher end matchas, where then you can really, really enjoy the taste aspect of the tea. Now, part of what happens, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, when the plant is shaded, it is challenging for the tea plant. The tea plant does have to struggle under that, and so higher grade matchas use the spring harvest, and then the tea plant is let to rest for the rest of the year. So the tea plant has time to recuperate, rejuvenate, and then it's really ready for the next year in the spring for another matcha harvest. But what you see with the lower grades out there is that actually a summer harvest will then be used to again make matcha, and an autumn harvest will again be used to make matcha. And that actually puts quite a lot of strain on the tea plant, and it means that it hasn't had time to repack it with those nutrients and those flavors, and so the quality, it has more bitterness. It's been under that hot sun, and so you just have very, very different flavor profiles. And the last thing which you will encounter also when you're looking at more culinary grade, lower grade green tea powders is actually tea which has not been shaded and which has not been ground by stone mills, but instead by some sort of like pulverizer or grinder. And so that's also an important distinction to make, because you can find very cheap green tea powder coming from China, even coming from Japan actually, but that's actually not the same thing as matcha, right? For matcha, we want that shading and we want that stone grinding. So, that was a lot of information about matcha. I think we'll probably stop here for now, and then next time we'll do a little bit of a taste comparison between these two. We'll look more also at the health benefits of matcha, and we'll look at what are the ways to actually make your own bowl of matcha at home. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to give us a thumbs up, and we'll see you soon. Bye.